Close your eyes, dear listener. Let the noise of the day melt away. Allow each breath to slow, like a soft breeze drifting through ancient ruins. Tonight, we set sail to the Hinterkaifeck farm murders. The snow came late that March, heavy and wet, swallowing the sound of the world. On the far edge of the Bavarian woods, Hinterkaifeck sat alone, a crooked house in a crooked clearing, its timbers dark with age, its chimney breathing faint ribbons of smoke against the cold gray sky. To the villagers in Kaifeck, a kilometer down the rutted road, the Gruber farm was as much a landmark as it was a warning. They said the soil there grew sweeter than anywhere else in the valley, that the wheat rose taller, greener, as if the earth beneath the farmhouse still remembered something, some bargain struck long before the war. Andreas Gruber never spoke of such things. At 63, he was a man of stone and splinters, shoulders knotted from decades of labor, hands rough as the barn beams, a face carved by wind and work and years of silence. He distrusted the village, and the village returned the favor. They called him eigenartig, peculiar, for his temper, for his secrets, for the way he locked his doors at night and still woke before dawn to patrol the edges of his fields. That morning, when he found the footprints, the fields were quiet. A single trail in the snow, coming from the forest, winding toward the barn, but not away from it. He crouched there for a long while, the frost biting through his knees, staring at those prints, heavy, deliberate, the stride of a man who knew the land. He followed them with his eyes to where they vanished in the shadow of the barn, as if the snow had swallowed them whole. No other tracks, no return path. When he rose, his breath hung in the air like smoke. From the woods, the crows stirred, their wings cracking like leather in the brittle sky. Inside, the house was warm but uneasy. Cecilia, the old woman, tended the stove with slow, tired hands, her scarf tied tight beneath her chin. Across the room, Victoria hummed to Joseph in the cradle, her voice thin, threadbare. The older child, 7-year-old Cecilia, sat cross-legged near the hearth, carving lines in the dirt with a stick, whispering a game to herself that no one else could hear. The house smelled of pine and boiled milk, but beneath it lingered something else, a faint copper tang, sharp and strange, that Andreas couldn't quite place. That night, the noises began again. Soft at first, almost imagined. A shifting in the attic, boards creaking as though someone were pacing above their heads. The dog barked once, then fell silent. Victoria froze, her hand on the cradle, eyes lifting to the ceiling. Andreas said nothing. He lit the lantern, climbed the ladder, and opened the hatch. The attic was still. Still and yet not empty. A corner shadow swayed, then stilled. Dust motes floated like ash through the beam of his light. There was no one there. But when he climbed down, when he latched the hatch behind him, the noise began again, softer now, like breathing. Andreas lay awake that night. The lantern burned low on the table beside him, throwing crooked shadows on the walls. But the house was no quieter for it. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it, a soft scrape, a shift, like boots dragging across rough boards above his head. He told himself it was rats. Big ones, maybe. Winter always drove them in. But rats didn't breathe. By morning,
The prints in the snow had vanished under a fresh layer of frost. The path to the barn was smooth now, untouched, as if the night itself had swallowed every trace of what had been there. Victoria found him at the window, staring out across the white yard. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. Andreas grunted, his jaw tight. "No." She hesitated before stepping closer. "It's just the wind in the roof beams, Father. Nothing more." But her eyes flickered to the ceiling as she said it, betraying her. She'd heard it too. Later that day, as dusk pulled its long fingers over the farm, the stranger appeared. He didn't come to the house, not directly. Victoria saw him first, just beyond the fence line, near where the orchard met the edge of the woods. A tall figure in a long, dark coat, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. She thought, for a moment, of calling out to him, but something in the way he stood, too still, too patient, froze the words in her throat. When she blinked, he was gone. The maid arrived that evening, Maria Baumgartner, a quiet girl with pale hands and a suitcase no bigger than a loaf of bread. She stepped down from the wagon, boots crunching on snow, her breath spilling in white clouds, and looked at the farmhouse as though it had been waiting for her. "It's only for a week," she told herself. "Just a week." But as Andreas helped her with her bag, the crows in the trees above stirred, restless, their wings rustling like dry leaves.
That night, the house felt smaller. The fire burned low, the walls creaked, and upstairs the sound in the attic came again, louder now, deliberate. The older child, little Cecilia, pressed her ear to the floorboards. "Mama," she whispered, "someone's up there." Victoria hushed her, clutching the girl close, rocking her gently, and in the dark above, the breathing paused, as if it had heard. The days bled together after that. Cold mornings, gray skies, the smell of damp earth and hay clinging to everything. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of the farm, something had shifted, a subtle, heavy weight that made the air feel thick, difficult to breathe. Andreas kept to the fields, chopping wood, tending to the cattle. He said nothing, but the furrow between his brows had deepened, a sharp crease carved by more than just age. Victoria watched him from the kitchen window, her hands red and raw from scrubbing. He walked the fence line twice that day, boots crunching over the crusted snow, always with the same tight, silent anger. The villagers in Kaifeck whispered, as they always did. They said Andreas had enemies, that the war had twisted men into things that didn't sleep right, didn't think right. Some said the land itself was cursed, that no family could live on it for long without losing themselves.
On the third night, the noises grew bolder. It started just after sundown, a dragging sound in the attic, like a sack being pulled slowly across the floor. Then came the steps, slow, measured, pacing back and forth, above their heads. Maria clutched her rosary in the maid's room, whispering prayers into the dark. Victoria gathered the children close to her in the main room, humming softly to still their trembling hands. Andreas took his rifle and climbed the ladder. The hatch creaked open. Silence. The beam of his lantern swept across empty boards, cold and still. Dust floated in the light like pale ghosts. No footprints. No sign of anything living. But as he turned to climb down, a draft
swept through the attic, sharp and bitter, and for the briefest moment he thought he heard someone whisper his name.
By morning, the world was white again. Another snowfall had erased the fields clean and quiet. But when Andreas stepped outside, he saw them. The same footprints coming from the woods, cutting a sharp line through the untouched snow, stopping at the barn. No return trail. He followed them slowly this time, rifle in hand, each step sinking into the frozen crust. His breath came in white bursts as he reached the barn door. Inside, the animals were restless, their eyes wide, whites flashing in the dim light. The cow stamped nervously, the horse tossing its head against the wooden stall. And then, silence. A stillness so deep it made his skin crawl. Victoria found him standing in the doorway an hour later, rifle lowered, staring at the ground. "What did you see?" she asked. Andreas didn't answer. That evening, the wind picked up. It howled through the rafters, rattled the shutters, made the whole house groan like it was alive. Maria packed her small suitcase, hands shaking. "I don't like it here," she told Victoria. "Something is wrong with this place. Wrong!" Victoria only nodded. There was nothing to say.
In the village, they spoke of omens. Old Frau Danner swore she'd seen a shadow near the woods that morning, tall and still, watching the road. Others muttered about deaths, about grudges long buried, but not forgotten. But one boy, no more than 12, swore he saw something else. "A man," he whispered to the blacksmith, "with no face, just black, where his face should be." The blacksmith cuffed him on the ear for lying, but the story spread like fire. On the night of March 30th, the house slept uneasy. The fire in the hearth burned low. The clock ticked steady in the quiet. And above it all, from the attic, came the sound of breathing, slow and patient, like something waiting for the right moment to move. The wind died just before dusk. The sudden stillness was so sharp it rang in the ears, as though the whole valley had been holding its breath. Andreas Gruber felt it first, a pressure in the air, heavy and strange, like the weight before a summer storm. He paused in the yard, hand tightening on the axe, eyes on the tree line where the woods bled into shadow. The snow there was untouched, but he knew better now. Inside, the house was dim. The lantern on the table burned weakly, its flame guttering every time the door groaned in the wind. Victoria was setting bread near the stove, her little boy gurgling softly in the cradle beside her. Her daughter sat curled in a corner, the hem of her dress clutched tight in her small fists. "Papa," little Cecilia whispered, "it's in the attic again." Andreas didn't answer. The dog barked once, sharp, warning, then went silent. Maria had just finished tidying the kitchen when she heard the first noise. Not the usual creaks, not the soft pacing she'd grown used to in her brief nights here. This was heavier, purposeful. A single step, then another, then silence. She froze, clutching the edge of the counter, her breath sharp in her throat. The lantern light trembled against the walls, throwing their shadows long and thin. Andreas took the lantern and the axe. "Stay inside," he told Victoria. His voice was low, tight, almost swallowed by the walls. "Lock the door behind me."
He stepped out into the cold. The snow crunched beneath his boots, loud in the night's quiet. The barn door stood ajar, swinging on its hinges like a slow pendulum. From the darkness within, something shifted.
What happened next would never be truly known. Some said Andreas was struck first, his lantern falling into the hay, light spilling across rough boards and frightened animals. Others claimed he fought, that the axe met wood and flesh before the silence returned. But when Victoria stepped out minutes later, calling her father's name, she too was swallowed by the dark of the barn. The girl was next. Little Cecilia, barefoot in the snow, trailing her mother's voice into the night, her small hands clutching the doorway. She hesitated at the threshold for just a breath before the barn took her too. Maria stayed frozen in the kitchen, the children behind her. She told herself not to move, not to breathe, to wait for Andreas to come stomping back through the door, cursing under his breath. But the door never opened. When the shadow finally crossed the threshold, Maria screamed, a high, thin sound swallowed by the crack of wood and the soft, dull thud of the axe. The house was still after that. The only sound was the crackle of the hearth and the soft whimper of the baby in the cradle. Hours passed. The lantern sputtered and died. And somewhere in the dark, the stranger fed the animals, threw wood into the fire, and climbed the narrow stairs to the attic.
For 4 days, the farm breathed but did not speak. The chimney puffed thin threads of smoke into the gray Bavarian sky. The cows were milked. The chickens fed. The dog, though restless, was quiet. From the road, nothing looked amiss. Neighbors passed, tipping their hats to the farmhouse as they always had, but no one came close. Not after the stories. Not after the whispers of strange footprints and shadows at the edge of the woods. On April 4th, young Caspar Schlittenbauer was the first to say it aloud. "It's been too quiet," he muttered to his companion, eyes fixed on the silent farmhouse. "Too long." His companion shrugged. They keep to themselves, always have. But even as he said it, his gaze drifted to the chimney, still smoking, steady as a heartbeat. That morning, when the postman came, he found the letters still waiting in the box, untouched. He thought it odd, but said nothing. Mail was often forgotten here. By evening, the silence had curdled into unease. On the 5th day, 3 men from the village walked the narrow path to Hinterkaifeck. Lorenz Schlittenbauer led the way, his boots sinking into the half-melted snow, rifle slung over his shoulder. Behind him trailed Jakob and Mikhail, their steps hesitant, their eyes darting to the forest. The farm stood still in the morning light. The dog barked from somewhere near the barn, sharp, frantic barks that echoed through the yard. "Something's wrong," Jakob muttered, voice low. Schlittenbauer ignored him, pushing forward. His hand trembled slightly as it gripped the latch of the barn door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and iron. And then they saw them.
Andreas first, crumpled near the door, his blood dark and frozen on the wooden boards. Victoria, her arms twisted as though reaching for something that had never come. Little Cecilia, her small body curled near the hay, her face tight with terror even in death. The men stumbled back, hands shaking, the weight of the scene pressing heavy in the stillness. Inside the house, they found the rest. Maria in the kitchen, her apron still stained with bread flour, and in the cradle, baby Yosef, still, silent, his blanket pulled neatly to his chin, as though someone had tucked him in after the world had gone quiet. "Holy God," Michael whispered, crossing himself again and again. But Schlittenbauer said nothing. He stared at the cradle, at the small, unmoving bundle, his jaw clenched tight. They fled the house and ran for the village, their shouts carrying through the morning air like gunfire. By midday, the path to the farm was thick with neighbors, their voices sharp with horror, their eyes darting to every shadow. But the house gave no answers, only the soft crackle of the dying fire, and above, from the attic, the faint sound of a single board creaking, slow and deliberate, like the echo of footsteps, long after the man had gone.
The news of Hinterkaifeck traveled faster than the thawing river. By the second day, half the village had gathered near the farmhouse, voices low and urgent, crossing themselves as they spoke. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Men whispered in sharp, clipped tones, glancing toward the forest as though it might lean closer to listen. No one wanted to step inside. Not after what the first search party had seen. Not after the barn. By noon, 2 men from Schrobenhausen arrived with the constable, Inspector Georg Reingruber, a man known more for his orderliness than for mercy. His black coat brushed the mud as he walked the yard, sharp eyes sweeping over every corner, every print in the softening snow. The trail of footprints, the same single line from the woods to the barn, was nearly gone now, melted under the hesitant sun. But they had been there. Every villager swore it. Reingruber didn't speak for a long while. Then, finally, in a voice as thin and precise as a scalpel, 6 dead. No sign of struggle outside. Whoever did this stayed. Inside, they began their grim work. The bodies were carried out, one by one, laid on rough boards in the yard. The priest came to bless them, his voice trembling over the old Latin words. Victoria's hair, once dark and smooth, was matted with blood, her eyes still open. Andreas's hands were clenched tight, as though still holding an axe, and little Cecilia, the girl's small hands, had clumps of her own hair torn out, as though she had fought even as she bled. The villagers averted their eyes, some whispered prayers, others only stared at the barn, their silence heavier than snow. By evening, the house had begun to speak in stories. "Lorenz Schlittenbauer," someone muttered, just loud enough for others to hear. "He quarreled with Andreas over Victoria. Everyone knows." Others shook their heads. "No, it was a drifter. Someone from the woods. You know the stories. Footsteps without return. The land cursed since old times." The old women spoke of things the younger men laughed at but did not dismiss. "That land has always been wrong," Frau Danner said, her voice low, the tip of her cane scratching circles in the dirt. "My grandmother said there was a man long ago who went missing in those trees. Said the forest took him. Said he came back with no shadow." She leaned closer, her breath sharp as pine sap. "And when the harvest failed, they buried him there, beneath the barn, to quiet the land." At night, the woods answered. Crows gathered in the trees, black knots in the gray branches, their voices sharp and relentless. Smoke from the chimney had stopped, but still, some swore they saw light flickering in the attic, a pale glow that moved like someone pacing. Children dared each other to step past the gate, to press their hands to the cold wood of the barn door. None lasted more than a few breaths before running, eyes wide, swearing they heard breathing from within. Inspector Reingruber wrote it all down, every footprint, every theory, every whisper that tangled truth with fear. "Someone lived here," he said, more to himself than anyone else. But why stay? Why not leave when it was done? The woods gave no answer. Only the creak of branches in the wind, the whisper of snow melting in the ditches, and the heavy, unrelenting silence of a house that had seen too much. The morning after the discovery, the road to Hinterkaifeck was a scar of boot prints and wagon tracks. Men came in uniform, their coats heavy and dark, their breath white in the frigid air. Inspector Georg Reingruber arrived first, a stiff-backed man with sharp cheekbones and a mind like a ledger. He had been with the Munich police for 20 years and had seen more blood than most men could stomach, but never like this. The silence of the farm unsettled him. Not the death, not the barn, the silence. The animals still lowed softly in their stalls. The dog barked once when the men approached, then sat in the snow, tail thumping weakly, as though waiting for someone who would never come. Inside, the house was untouched. Bread on the table, milk in the pail, Victoria's shawl folded neatly on the chair by the fire. It felt wrong, too orderly, too quiet, as though the family had simply stepped outside and forgotten to return. Reingruber ran a gloved hand along the table, then looked up toward the narrow attic stairs. "Search everything," he said. His voice did not rise, but the men obeyed at once. They found nothing in the attic but dust and rat droppings. No blood, no discarded weapon, no sign of struggle. But the boards told another story. Faint scuffs where someone had walked, back and forth, night after night, pacing the narrow space as the family slept below. By noon, the first theories were already taking root. "Schlittenbauer," said Jakob, one of the neighbors, his voice sharp as a blade. "You know he wanted Victoria. Everyone knows. Maybe Andreas pushed him too far." Others shook their heads. No, this was no crime of passion. This was patience. Someone waited. Someone watched. You don't hide in a house for days without purpose. That afternoon, Reingruber called Schlittenbauer to the farmhouse. The man arrived, pale but steady, his boots muddy from the thaw. He did not flinch when they led him through the barn, past the blood-darkened boards where the bodies had been found. "Why did you come here first?" Reingruber asked him. "Because no one else would," Schlittenbauer replied. His voice was even, but his hands betrayed him, restless, twisting, clenching, releasing. "You argued with Andreas?" "Yes, many times." "Over Victoria?" A pause, then quiet but clear. "Yes." Word of the interrogation spread fast, curling through the village like smoke. Some swore Schlittenbauer had confessed outright. Others said he had cursed the inspector and stormed away. The truth was far duller. He had walked home in silence, the weight of every gaze heavy on his back. For weeks, the investigation wound in circles. Over 100 suspects were questioned. Farmhands, drifters, soldiers long returned from the war, even Victoria's rumored lovers. But no arrest ever came. Theories multiplied like weeds. Some swore it was a stranger, a drifter passing through, drawn by the farm's isolation. Others whispered that Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, never truly died in the war, that he had returned, broken and quiet, to find his wife in another man's arms.
And then there were the older stories, the ones that crept through the village at night, that the land itself had called for blood, that the farm had never belonged to the living at all. Inspector Reingruber dismissed the talk of curses and restless spirits, but even he could not ignore the details that refused to align. The footprints with no return path, the food taken from the pantry, the animals tended with quiet care. He told his men again and again, someone lived here, someone stayed, and someone left without a trace. But Hinterkaifeck had already closed its mouth. Whatever truth lingered there had been swallowed by the woods, buried beneath the thawing snow, and left to rot in the damp silence of early spring.
The murders should have faded as the thaw came. Winter loosens everything in Bavaria. Ice, grief, even fear. By spring, the fields were soft, green with promise, and the birds sang as though nothing had ever been wrong. But at Hinterkaifeck, the silence clung. The house stood empty, its windows black hollows staring across the meadow. Even in daylight, no one lingered near it. Children dared each other to run to the gate, to lay a hand on the cold wood of the barn, but none stayed long enough to cross the threshold. In the evenings, when the sun slipped behind the woods and the air went blue and thin, the villagers spoke in hushed tones. "It was never a man," whispered Frau Danner, her old eyes sharp as nails. "The land has been hungry since before my grandfather's time." "Hungry?" the blacksmith scoffed. "For what?" "For blood," she said simply. "The Grubers just forgot the bargain." Others told stories of the attic, of the strange noises, the pacing footsteps no one could find. They said the house had been a meeting ground once, centuries ago, when the old faith still ruled the valleys, a place where shadows gathered, where something in the woods listened and waited. Some claimed that Victoria had been cursed, that the war had brought something home with her husband, something that stayed, even after his body was swallowed by the mud of Flanders. And then there were the children, whose whispers carried further than they should. One boy swore he saw a man standing at the edge of the forest 2 nights after the bodies were found. A man with no face, just a hollow where his eyes should have been. Another said the barn glowed some nights, pale light flickering through the cracks, as though the house itself were still breathing.
Inspector Reingruber wrote every story down in his ledger, though he did not believe them. "People talk," he muttered to his assistant. "Fear breeds nonsense." But when he stood alone in the barn that evening, notebook in hand, he couldn't shake the chill that ran up his spine, as though something unseen watched from the shadows above the rafters. The priest came once, reluctantly. He sprinkled holy water through the house, muttering prayers in low, urgent Latin, and nailed a small wooden cross above the kitchen door. When he stepped outside, his face pale and drawn, he told the waiting crowd only this: "Leave it. Let the house rot. Nothing good will grow here again." But the myths kept growing, fed by silence and fear. They said the land refused to be plowed that spring, the soil turning up black and clotted, the furrows filling with water that never drained. They said the dog, tied in the yard until the police took him away, howled every night, long and low, until his voice broke. And they said that sometimes, when the wind turned just right, you could still hear the sound of footsteps pacing in the attic, slow, steady, patient.
By midsummer, the house was more than just abandoned. It had become a wound, raw and open, festering with stories that no one dared test. The villagers no longer spoke of who might have done it. Instead, they whispered only of what had been left behind.
Inspector George Reingruber had begun to dream of the farm. Not the barn, not the blood, but the quiet. The way the house sat against the woods, watching, waiting. He would wake before dawn, the edges of the dream already fraying, and find his notes scattered across the desk, pages filled with the same words scrawled in an unsteady hand. Someone stayed. Someone watched. Someone never left. By July, the investigation had turned inward. If the killer had not come from outside, perhaps he had been born there, in the farmhouse, in the Gruber bloodline itself. Reingruber began with the patriarch, Andreas Gruber. The villagers had never liked him. That much was clear in every interview, every whispered conversation. He had been sharp-tongued and controlling, a man who held his family like a clenched fist. And then there were the rumors. Rumors that Victoria, his widowed daughter, had not been widowed at all, that her first child, little Cecilia, had been born not of her husband, Karl Gabriel, but of her own father. The inspector had read the court records himself, the faded ink still legible, charges of incest filed, then dismissed for lack of evidence. Reingruber stared at the words long after the candles burned low. The villagers had known. They had all known. And yet when asked now, their mouths closed like steel traps. The deeper he dug, the stranger the story became. Victoria had tried to leave more than once. Letters to a distant cousin hinted at a plan to take her children and start over somewhere far from Bavaria. But the letters stopped abruptly. No one knew why. And then there was the matter of her second child, little Joseph. No one could agree on who the boy's father was. Some said Andreas, others swore it was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had once courted Victoria. The uncertainty twisted tighter when Reingruber unearthed an unsigned letter found in the ashes of the kitchen stove. You will never be free. The house does not forget.
In the quiet hours, the inspector began to map the family's history. Not just the Grubers, but the land itself. Hinterkaifeck had always been isolated, even before the war. Old records from the parish archives spoke of fires, unexplained disappearances, and a long line of owners who had either died young or left in ruin. One name recurred, carved into the faded ledgers like a shadow. Kaifeck. A family line that vanished sometime in the late 1600s, leaving nothing but a name and a tract of land no one wanted to farm. By August, Reingruber could no longer separate fact from story. He heard the whispers in the village that the inspector had begun spending too much time on the property, standing in the empty attic long after the sun had set, his boots quiet against the floorboards, as though listening for something only he could hear. Some nights, the children said, they saw the flicker of a lantern moving through the barn, slow and steady, long after the last investigator had gone home. One evening, while cataloging the family's possessions, Reingruber found a locked box beneath the floorboards in the parents' bedroom. Inside were photographs, brittle with age, and a small leather-bound book filled with strange symbols. Not Latin, not German, something older. At the back, written in Victoria's careful hand, was a single line. "The house does not forgive. It only waits."
By the time the first frost settled over Hinterkaifeck again, Inspector Georg Reingruber was no longer the same man. The villagers saw at first the way he walked the muddy path to the farm each dawn, how he lingered there long after the sun had vanished, his coat coated in ash and dust. He no longer carried his notebook, no longer asked questions. He only watched the empty house. Some said they saw him speaking to it. Others said the house spoke back. Winter came early that year. The woods thickened with silence, the sky bruised and low. The farm stood hollow but unbroken, its timbers blackened with age, its windows reflecting nothing. And yet, at night, a pale light flickered in the attic, as though someone still climbed those stairs, still paced those floors. On December 12th, Frau Danner, the old woman who had first warned of the land's hunger, found Reingruber's notebook nailed to her door. Inside, the pages were filled edge to edge with one sentence, written over and over until the words blurred into scratches. "The house does not forgive. The house does not forget." The last page bore a single shaky line. "They never left." The next morning, the villagers found his footprints in the snow, leading from the edge of the forest to the barn. Only one set went in. None came out.
By spring, Hinterkaifeck had begun to rot. The roof sagged inward, the windows shattered by storms. But no one dared to tear it down. Children dared each other to creep close, to press their ears to the wood and listen. Some swore they heard footsteps overhead, slow and steady, pacing in the attic. Others swore they heard laughter, high, soft, and wrong. By midsummer, the fields around the house refused to grow. The soil turned black, thick with rot, as though something deep below had poisoned it. The villagers whispered of bargains broken, of bloodlines cursed, of a hunger that could never be sated. And then, one night, a glow rose from the farmhouse, pale and cold, spilling across the fields like fog. Those who saw it said they heard voices carried on the wind. Victoria's voice, soft and sad. Little Casilia crying for her mother. And beneath it all, the sound of footsteps, slow, steady, patient, echoing from the attic, counting down the years until the land would take again. By autumn, the house had finally collapsed under its own weight. The debris smoldered for days without flame, leaving only a hollow, blackened scar where the farmhouse had stood. But even now, when the nights grow long and the air sharp with winter, the locals say you can still see the path across the field, the narrow frozen track of footprints leading into the ruins. And if you stand there, quiet and still, you can hear it. The faint creak of footsteps above you, the sound of someone pacing, waiting, always waiting. The land never gave them back, and it never will.